Homeless people are vanishing across America. But not because they're finding homes. Entire encampments are being cleared, neighbors and friends disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. What's really happening to the people society has already forgotten. On a cold morning in early 2025, the streets of Los Angeles look strangely empty. Where rows of tents once stood on the sidewalks of Skid Row, there are only scraps of blankets, broken carts, and piles of clothes left behind. City records show that in just 6 months, the official homeless count has dropped by nearly 18%. Across the country, more than 600,000 people were reported homeless last year. Yet new reports suggest tens of thousands are simply no longer being counted. The numbers don't add up, and the sight of silent, abandoned blocks tells a story no statistic alone can explain. In Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood, neighbors recall seeing dozens of tents vanish overnight, leaving behind needles, shoes, and family photos scattered in the mud. One day my neighbor James was here, a woman says softly. The next day his tent was gone. Nobody's seen him since. The urgency is felt everywhere. In Phoenix, advocates track sudden changes in their city's numbers. National reports show a steady rise in homelessness by 12% over the past year. Yet Phoenix shows a sudden drop of 22% in its official count. People know this is not the result of housing miracles. Local shelters are already beyond full. Rental prices have gone up nearly 30% in 3 years, and waiting lists for affordable housing stretch for years. A man named Carlos, living near a freeway underpass, recalls the night his camp was swept. They came with trucks, told us to leave, said they'd help, but they never came back. By morning, half the people were just gone. The silence in his voice carries a weight heavier than his words. The root causes are plain to see, yet the crisis grows darker as cities fight to make homelessness less visible. Sky-high rents force families out. Cuts in mental health services leave people untreated. Addiction spreads in neighborhoods where jobs have dried up and clinics have closed. National trends show housing costs rising faster than wages in nearly every major city. But the vanishing of entire encampments feels like a warning of something larger. The reality is not only about poverty or addiction. It is about being erased. As the camera lingers on broken tents and forgotten shoes, the scale of the problem becomes clear. People are not finding homes. They are being pushed out of sight. The crisis is not only growing, it is being hidden. When you look closer, the threads begin to connect. These vanishings are not random but tied to a web of pressures pulling on the most vulnerable. In Austin, entire camps once stood in parks close to busy highways. Now they are gone, swept under new public safety rules. The people who once lived there scatter to wooded areas, drainage tunnels, and abandoned buildings. Police and city crews clear them in the name of order, but no one follows where they go. Those who remain say their friends often leave with city workers promising shelter, yet few ever come back. They said they'd take him to housing. A young man explains about his brother. I checked every shelter. He's nowhere. In many cities, economic shifts add new weight to already fragile lives. Jobs that once offered steady pay disappear, replaced by gig work that cannot cover rent. Families live on the edge, one paycheck away from sleeping in their cars. The stigma of homelessness keeps people from speaking openly, while rules push them further out of sight. In Chicago, officials close underpasses before winter storms, driving people into more dangerous places. In San Francisco, residents call the police to clear blocks where property values are rising, and the city responds. The cycle repeats until whole communities fade from the streets. Within these fragile networks, survival itself becomes a kind of silence. People learn to blend into shadows, moving from one hidden spot to the next, because being seen means being swept. Addiction grows in the dark, untreated. Mental illness worsens with isolation. In places like Kensington, where the opioid crisis runs deep, disappearances are almost expected. Here today, gone tomorrow, one local man says, shrugging. That's just how it is. But his voice carries fear beneath the words, a fear that tomorrow it might be him. When entire groups vanish, the question becomes not only where they went, but why no one is looking. It is easier for cities to measure emptier streets than to track human lives. It is easier to count fewer tents than to face the truth of what happens when those tents are gone. And yet the silence spreads, camp by camp, city by city. The disappearance of America's homeless is not only a crisis of housing, but of dignity, and the web of connections binding it is tighter and more dangerous than most are willing to admit. If whole communities can vanish without explanation, what does that say about how much, or how little, we value the lives of those who have nowhere else to go? The connections begin to show the moment you look closer at the streets where people once lived. In Austin, a large camp near a busy highway was cleared in less than one night. The ground still shows dark lines where tents had pressed into the dirt, and the smell of smoke from old campfires lingers in the air. But the people are gone. Residents nearby say city workers told the campers they would be offered shelter beds. Yet every shelter in the city has been full for months. The sweep was not about help. It was about being seen. What happens after is a puzzle no one seems willing to solve. Some people scatter into wooded areas, others slip into storm drains, and many more vanish with no clear record. The local numbers show the homeless population dropping by almost 20%. But when you walk the side streets, you find only silence and shadows where whole groups used to be. The ties between money, power, and place explain much of why this happens here. Austin has grown fast, with rents jumping more than 25% in just 3 years. Families that once lived in small apartments are pushed out as new condos rise. Those who fall onto the street become easy targets for removal, because the city wants tourists and new buyers to see clean sidewalks. The more the city grows, the more it pushes its poorest residents out of sight. This is not only about housing but about image, and that makes the problem even harder to face. One man who lost his job as a cook says he feels like he is treated as trash left on the curb. We're invisible until someone calls the police, he says, standing in the corner of a parking lot, his voice low, his hands shaking from hunger. Farther north, in Chicago, the same web stretches under highway bridges. People once built small shelters from wood and tarps there, close to public bathrooms and food pantries. But as winter came, the city blocked the underpasses, forcing everyone out. Some were told to go to warming centers, but many of those centers closed within weeks. When the snow melted, the spaces were empty. The homeless count reported by the city showed a steep drop, yet the service providers saw more people than ever at food lines. The math does not fit, and the gap between the two truths grows wider every month. For those still outside, survival means staying quiet, moving often, and trusting no one. The web does not only involve money and rules, it also wraps around health, both physical and mental. In Philadelphia's Kensington area, many who vanish are pulled down by drugs that make them easier to move, easier to forget. The open-air drug market once drew crowds, but police raids have scattered people into side streets and tunnels. A woman who has lived there for 6 years says she has lost count of how many neighbors have disappeared. "We just stopped seeing them," she whispers, her eyes red. Sometimes they overdosed. Sometimes the cops took them. Sometimes they just never came back. The fear in her voice is thick, as if she knows she could be next. When you listen long enough, a pattern appears. These vanishings are not random but follow the lines of pressure that stretch across every city. In Los Angeles, sweeps follow new rules about safety zones near schools. In Phoenix, they follow freeway construction projects. In San Francisco, they follow property complaints. Wherever there is money, new building, or rising land value, the people living outside are pushed away. Each move forces them into smaller, more dangerous spaces. Each move cuts them off from services they need to live, and each move makes them easier to erase from the public eye. The silence inside these webs is heavy. People who are left behind often stop asking questions because the answers are too painful. A young man in Austin says he has not seen his brother since a sweep 3 months ago. He has checked every shelter and every hospital, but no one has records. It's like he was never here, he says, his face pale in the afternoon light. The fear in his words is matched by the cold fact that no one is keeping track. For the city, the numbers look better. For families, the loss is beyond measure. This is why the problem feels so different here, why it digs so deep. The homeless in these places are not only poor but trapped by barriers that are unique to their cities. In Austin, it is fast growth and rising rents. In Chicago, it is harsh winters and locked underpasses. In Philadelphia, it is the pull of drugs and the push of raids. In each case, the web is thick, built for money, laws, stigma, and silence. To live inside it is to live on borrowed time. Each day carries the question of who will vanish next, and whether anyone will even notice when they do. The cycle begins the moment someone is pushed from one place to the next. In Phoenix, people once slept under a wide bridge near the freeway, where the sound of trucks drowned out the noise of the city. After a sweep, they were forced into the desert, far from bus stops and food lines. Out there, the sun burned the ground to 110 degrees, and the nearest shelter was 6 miles away. A man named Daryl sat in the sand with blisters on his feet, holding an empty water bottle. He said the city told him help was coming, but weeks passed with nothing. His story shows how one action meant to clean a street only made his life more dangerous. The sweep did not solve his problem. It only pushed him deeper into it. In Los Angeles, families once huddled together in tents on Skid Row where they shared food and looked out for each other. When the tents were cleared, the families broke apart. One mother ended up in a women's shelter that closed 2 months later. Her children were taken into foster care, and she now spends every day trying to find them. What began as a simple sweep grew into a storm of broken ties, lost safety, and deep pain that will not heal quickly. For her, the cycle is not only about poverty, but about the loss of family. Each step of the system meant to bring order has only pulled her farther from stability. The cycle shows itself again in the way jail becomes part of the story. In San Francisco, police arrest people for sleeping in doorways. A night in jail turns into weeks of court dates, lost belongings, and a new record that makes it harder to find a job. A man named Kevin, once a painter, says he lost his tools after an arrest because the city threw them away during a sweep. With no tools, he cannot work. With no work, he cannot rent. With no rent, he ends up back on the street, where the same arrest is waiting. His story spins in a circle that feels impossible to break. The very rules meant to push him toward change are the ones keeping him trapped. Even programs that sound helpful often feed the cycle. In some cities, hotel vouchers are handed out after sweeps. For a short time, people get a bed, a shower, and a roof. But the voucher ends after a week or two, and many find themselves back outside, now even farther from the networks they relied on. A woman in Chicago describes the day she left her hotel and returned to the underpass. "Everyone I knew was gone," she says, staring at the cold concrete where her tent once stood. "I was alone, and it was worse than before." What was promised as help became another way of scattering people and erasing their safety nets. Mental health is another thread in the cycle. A man in Philadelphia describes how the stress of being moved again and again made his anxiety spiral. Without steady medicine or care, his panic attacks grew until he could no longer stand in line for food. Isolation pushed him deeper into addiction, and each time he disappeared from sight, his chance of recovery grew smaller. His voice shakes as he admits, "It's like the world wants me gone." The lack of treatment, the sweeps, the stigma, they feed each other, trapping him in a loop he cannot escape alone. The long-term effects of this cycle are written in broken lives. Children who lose their parents in the process grow up in foster care, often repeating the same path years later. People who once worked steady jobs now carry records that follow them everywhere. The deeper someone falls into the cycle, the harder it is to climb out. The city may mark a drop in numbers, but the truth is hidden behind the lines. Each clean street is a story of someone pushed further down a path of loss. The cycle is not only personal but systemic. Policies that focus on moving people out instead of lifting them up keep the wheel turning. Cities celebrate smaller counts but never ask where the missing have gone. The gap between the image of success and the reality of suffering grows wider every day. The same rules that claim to solve the problem often make it worse. By treating homelessness as a nuisance instead of a human crisis, the system builds walls that trap the very people it is meant to help. At the heart of this cycle is a truth many do not want to face. The problem is not only the loss of shelter but the loss of hope. Each sweep, each arrest, each broken promise cuts away at the spirit until people vanish, not just from the streets but from the story itself. This is why the crisis feels endless. The cycle does not stop, it feeds itself. And until the wheel is broken, the vanishings will continue, one by one, until whole communities are gone, leaving only shadows and silence in their place. In the midst of all the pain and silence, there are still sparks of hope that show what can be done when people choose to see the homeless not as a problem but as neighbors. In Seattle, a new program sends out small teams that walk the streets every morning. Each team has a nurse, a social worker, and a person who once lived on the street. They carry water, clean socks, and medicine. They do not just tell people to move. They sit, listen, and ask what is needed. A man who had been living under a bridge for years was finally able to get steady medicine for his depression through one of these teams. With help, he later moved into a small apartment where he now helps the same outreach workers find others who are still outside. His story shows what happens when the cycle is broken with care instead of force. In Vermont, a housing program tried something bold. Instead of waiting for people to get sober or prove they could follow strict rules, they offered them permanent homes first. The state found that giving someone a key to their own space was the first step to healing. One man who had been homeless for a decade said that the moment he closed the door to his own room, he felt safe enough to face his addiction. Within 2 years, Vermont reported a 40% drop in chronic homelessness. The numbers stand in clear contrast to cities that only sweep and scatter, where the problem grows no matter how many tents are taken down. In Los Angeles, a group of churches opened their doors not just for Sunday services but for nightly shelter. They offered cots, meals, and showers, but also classes in cooking, carpentry, and money skills. One young woman who had been living in a tent with her baby learned how to bake bread through the program. Now she works at a bakery and rents a small apartment. She smiles when she speaks of her child sleeping in a real bed. "It feels like life again," she says. This local effort shows that solutions do not always need to be huge to be powerful. Sometimes they begin with neighbors choosing to care for one another. Even in Phoenix, where the desert heat makes life outside brutal, there are new ideas taking shape. A nonprofit set up mobile clinics that drive into camps with air-conditioned vans. They offer checkups, addiction treatment, and legal advice right where people are. A man who had lost his ID card and could not apply for work got help filling out the forms in one of these vans. Weeks later, he found a job at a construction site. Without that van, he says, he would still be stuck under the bridge. The clinic staff understand that help has to come to the people, not wait for them to find a way across miles of barriers. The lesson is clear when you compare these programs to the old ways. Sweeps, arrests, and short-term vouchers do not end homelessness. They only move it. But when housing, healthcare, and support come together, lives begin to change. The models that work are those that treat people with dignity and patience. They focus on stability first, then recovery, then growth. They understand that no one heals while sleeping in fear on a sidewalk. A former homeless woman in Seattle now works as a peer counselor. She tells her story to anyone who will listen. She explains how years of being swept from one place to another broke her spirit. But what saved her was someone who refused to give up. "It wasn't the rules that saved me," she says. "It was a person believing I deserved a home." She now walks the streets with outreach teams, telling those still outside that they too are worth saving. Her reflection reminds us that solutions are not only about money or buildings. They are about belief, kindness, and the simple act of seeing people as human. This does not mean the work is easy. In every city there are challenges. Funding is limited, shelters close, and people fall through cracks. But the models that succeed prove that change is possible when systems are aligned. A city cannot only rely on one program. It must weave together housing, medical care, job training, and mental health treatment. These supports must be steady and long-term, not fragile promises that vanish in a month. Ending homelessness is not a single task. It is a chain of connected efforts, each link holding the next. The future depends on whether America is willing to face the truth. Vanishing homeless populations do not mean the crisis is solved. They mean people are being hidden, pushed, or forgotten. To break this cycle, we must look past numbers and see the lives behind them. Imagine if every city built programs like Vermont's Housing First model or Seattle's outreach teams. Imagine if every neighborhood opened its doors like the churches in Los Angeles. Imagine if every clinic rolled into camps like the vans in Phoenix. The silence on our streets would be replaced with voices, stories, and futures once thought lost. So the question remains, what kind of country do we want to be? One that hides its most vulnerable, or one that brings them back into the light? The answer lies in our choices today. To break the cycle, we must move beyond short fixes and commit to real, lasting change. We must see homelessness not as a stain to be erased, but as a challenge that demands compassion and action. These are not numbers. These are people. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. They deserve more than to vanish unseen. As the music swells and the screen fades, a call appears. Learn more. Get involved. No one should vanish without a trace. And with that message, the story does not end. It begins again in every city, with every person who chooses to care and every voice that refuses to let silence be the final word.